The carry roll ratio with a gap wedge is 50-50. With a 6-iron, it's 20% carry, 80% rollout. With an 8-iron, it's 1/3 carry, 2/3 roll. With a sand wedge, it's 2/3 carry, 1/3 roll. And with a lob wedge, it's 80% carry, 20% rollout. In my chipping system, classical chipping, you only have those 5 clubs. Again, that's if it's a level green, obviously. If you're playing on medium-sized greens, which is 99% of golf courses are medium-sized greens, classical chipping will be the most commonly used short game shot.
Hi, this is Denny Harris from Gage, Oklahoma, and I play at the Shattuck Golf Course. This is Golf Smarter 941.
Short game tricks and tips you can use and myths to avoid with our old friend Jim Waldron.
This is Golf Smarter, sharing stories, tips, and insights from great golf minds to help you lower your score and raise your golf IQ. Here's your host, Fred Greene.
Welcome back to the Golf Smarter podcast, Jim.
Great to be here, Fred. I think this is episode 30 or 31 for me, something like that.
70 or 75. I don't know. Yeah, great to have you back. I've been going, everybody, the listening audience is aware that I've been going through stuff with my arm, but it's about to end. I think I'm ready to start playing again. And so yesterday was the first day I took full swings. And it was my back that was a little sore, but my arm was okay. And so I'm going to try to play 18 tomorrow. I'm going to go to physical therapy today and see. But of course, what I've been doing in my head for the last 4 months is don't beat yourself up. Don't get caught up in the fact that you're rusty and stuff. You know what you have to do. You know how to do it. Just go out there and take it easy and be easy on yourself and let it, club up.
That's good advice. Club up, take it easy, swing easy.
Yeah,
for sure. Good
advice. But what else, Coach? What do I need? How do I get past this?
You need a better short game, which is the topic of today. But in terms of the health, I mean, I'm actually a pretty good person to ask that to, because I've struggled off and on in my golf career with low back and hip issues. But I think in general, and do as I say, not as I do. I've always tended to come back too early and re-injure it.
Really?
As my wife will tell you, I'm stubborn. So I'll just, physical therapists will say, give it 3 months and then slowly come back into it. And I'll give it 6 weeks and come back to it. And so, don't do that. Give it time to heal for sure.
Yeah, I'm going on 4 months now. So since the last time I played golf. So I took luckily we've had a lot of rain here in Northern California, so I haven't missed much and I've been traveling a bunch. But I've also tried to take the mindset of my friends in the Midwest and the Northern Midwest and going hey, I don't get to play for 5 or 6 months because of bad weather. So I'm trying to they do this every year and I'm whining about it that I have to do one time. I have to wait for a couple months.
In California, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Florida, California, Texas, Arizona, we get to play all year long.
Mexico.
Exactly. Hawaii.
Yeah.
But I'm ready to thaw out here from my winter.
Cool.
So let's talk about where do I start? Short game that's the one thing I started practicing a week ago in my yard. I've been putting and just doing some short game stuff.
Yeah.
I feel if I'm tuned in on that, I should be okay.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. Plus, you could argue that the short game, and there are a lot of good teachers who start with putting. They teach putting first, then they teach chipping, then pitching. So there's a kind of a developmental aspect because it's, the idea being the shorter the swing, the slower the tempo of the swing, the less moving parts, the easier it is to learn to some level of mastery. So,
it makes sense.
But I think the short game is an under-taught or poorly taught aspect of our sport. There's lots of myths, I think, in traditional teaching about the short game. The big one is that a short game swing, particularly like a less than full backswing, so like a 3/4 backswing or half a backswing or a 1/4 length backswing, like in a traditional chipping stroke, is just a micro version of your power swing. That's the big myth. It's just not true. There's more differences than there are commonalities between any short game swing that's within about 60 yards of the pin or less. There's fundamental differences that I spend a lot of time in my coaching practice pointing out to my students. So, for example, the tempo is completely different. If you define one way you can define tempo is the RPM speed that your upper body pivots. It's significantly slower. It's going to be 25 to 30% slower RPM speed than your power.
Wow, that much?
Yeah, and I see people come to see me with terrible short games. I get a lot of people with short game yips, and they're rotating their chest on a little chip shot that's only going to travel maybe 10 yards in the air with like a gap wedge, and they're rotating their chest the same speed they would rotate on a driver, which is crazy, right?
But you should be rotating your.
No, you should be rotating your chest 25 to 30% slower RPM speed.
But you still should be rotating. You shouldn't be like, it's not all arms.
Oh God, no, it's definitely not all arms. In fact, that's another myth, is that it's mostly, because it's a shorter shot, you should use the so-called levers. And the levers in the golf swing are our two upper arms where they connect to our shoulder sockets, our trail elbow folding and unfolding, and of course our wrist cocking and uncocking. And the reality is, at least the way I understand the short game and the way I teach it, is it's more pivot driven in the short game, with a few exceptions, than even your power swing. In other words, you hit the ball more with your body turning through the shot on a little short shot than you do on a longer shot.
Really?
Yeah. The speed is obviously less, like we talked about a second ago.
Yeah.
You're going to turn through at a slower rate of speed. But the contribution, in other words, the relative contribution of the lever system versus the pivot system, there's less lever action on most short game shots and more pivot action compared to your power swing. It's just the opposite of what most amateurs think.
I'm blown away. Keep going.
Well, Roberto, you know who DiVincenzo is, who lost the Masters in '68 because he signed the incorrect scorecard? The guy from Argentina, Roberto DiVincenzo. Yeah.
Sure.
He famously said, he was referring to all his golf shots, short game and long game, but I bring this up for a reason. He said, when I play my best golf, I hit the ball with my stomach. So he was identifying with the rotation of the midsection of his body, the so-called core, right? And when you're doing your best short game shots, it's not that there's no contribution. While there is on classical chipping, there should be no wrist action on classical chipping. We can go more in depth on that in a minute, but on every shot other than classical chipping, there's always going to be some degree of lever action, primarily how you use your wrist. But it's still mostly your body. If you wanted to quantify the motion, it's still mostly a pivot motion. Whereas when I work with people who come to see me either with chipping yips or short game yips, or just they don't have yips, but they have really bad short games, it's like they're trying not to turn their body hardly at all. And they're just sort of throwing their arms at it, throwing their wrists at it, and they can't make solid contact. And, the whole thing about the short game is you got to be able to control, in terms of what the ball does, three things with consistency, which are the carry distance, meaning hitting your landing spot, the trajectory, and there's four trajectories. There's low, medium, high, and super high being a flop shot. And then the spin, the amount of backspin, which are low, medium, and high spin. And the backspin, along with the trajectory, determine how much rollout there is after the ball lands, right? So to do those three things consistently well, you have to be able to make solid contact. And almost everybody who comes to see me with short game issues, they're not making solid contact. Now, they may have distance control issues that they think are sort of standalone flaws, but they're really, the distance control issue is because they're not making consistent contact, meaning on one chip shot, they'll hit it thin. It'll have too much overspin. It'll roll like 20 feet by the hole. And with the same club on the next chip shot, they'll hit it fat, they'll hit it heavy, and they'll be way short of the hole, right? So what I teach is on the short game, you got to be able to control, to have solidness of contact, you got to be able to control the angle of attack, which is the angle that the club head comes in from from skyward toward ground level when it hits the ball. So that could be either a shallow angle, like on a flop shot, or a steep angle, like on a low spinning wedge shot. Right. And generally speaking, most short game shots, you want your angle of attack to be somewhere in between those two extremes, not steep and not shallow, kind of medium. You have to be able to control where the club bottoms out, which is called the low point. And since there are many, many different types of short game shots, they all have different low points. So you have to know, where should my low point be on this type of a shot versus another type of shot, and be able to reproduce it. And when I'm working with a new student who has short game issues, they can't make the club bottom out where I want them to bottom out.
But that's on all swings.
Well, generally speaking, even on power swings, yeah, but it's almost always significantly worse. People who have poor low point control in their power swing, 10 times worse than their short game.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And the third issue is you have to have the proper amount of forward shaftling. Now, that could be as little as none on a traditional flop shot, where the club shaft is 90 degrees to the ground at the moment of impact. Or you could have, like in a low spinning wedge, hitting like a gap wedge or a pitching wedge. I actually had a lesson on how to do this from Lee Trevino 20 years ago down in Palm Springs.
Wow.
Where he has, he's got his hands on this low spinning wedge shot he showed me. He's got like 10, 12 inches of forward shaftling, insane amount, right?
Yeah.
So controlling where the shaftling is, that's a big part of it.
I want to go more into that. I want to take a break right now, but I want to come back and talk about the shaft lean because of what I've observed so many amateurs doing, and we'll be back right after this.
You bet.
Jimmy, when I watch a lot of people that I play with, we're mid-handicap, maybe some of us are high single, but still mid-handicappers. There's a lot of scooping going on. It's you see them trying to chip the ball or pitch the ball, and they're trying to get under it and lift it up.
Correct.
Right.
It's the number one issue in short game. For sure.
Is it really?
Yeah. Back to the earlier conversation. That's one reason why people don't hit the ball solidly, because they're presenting the club face to the back of the ball with reverse shaftling, which is death in golf. You can hit it either really thin and scull it over the green, or you can hit it really fat doing that.
Yeah, there's actually some videos going around right now, Jim Venettos and even Mickelson, where they're talking about the shaft lean, and that amateurs, lean the shaft back to behind them, and it's like, and pros don't. They have that forward shaft lean and keeping the face of the club and the edge of the club square to the target.
It's interesting. There aren't often universal throughout the different skill categories flaws, but there is one, and that is scooping in the short game. I've worked with multiple tour pros who came to me with short game yips. These are guys who have plenty of shaftling. When they're hitting an iron off the fairway, like with a 6 iron, they'll have 8 inches of shaftling, 6 inches of shaftling, something like that. And then a little delicate little chip shot, they have reverse shaftling and impact. They're scooping it. I mean, really good ball strikers are scooping. And of course, same with a high handicapper. They scoop everything. So it's much more prevalent in the short game than it is in the power game, the scooping impulse.
Interesting.
Especially if someone has yips. I've worked with hundreds of people in the last decade or so who have severe short game yips. I've never had a single one who didn't have scooping impulse. In fact, there's a funny story about this, I'll tell you. About 2 summers ago in Portland, I had a guy who came to see me for 3 days who had really bad, he was about a 12 handicap, really bad short game yips. And we identified right away, you're scooping. You got to stop scooping. You have to hit down on the ball to some degree, coming in at a moderately steep angle of attack with, some amount of shaftling. He understood it all intellectually, couldn't do it. And he had 2 ways he was doing it. He was flipping his right wrist sideways like this, right? And for the audio listeners, I'm showing how the club head can pass your hands by unhinging the angle in the back of the right wrist. And he was pulling his left elbow in. So both of those are common ways you can add loft to the club face. Which again, trying to add loft is scooping. So we fixed it. It took me about 3 hours to fix both of those flaws. And I'm thinking, he's done, right? Now he's going to start hitting the ball really solid. All of a sudden, he starts tilting his right shoulder down too much. He wasn't doing that before.
Oh,
so we fixed
because he's still trying to scoop.
He's still trying to scoop. Of course, his unconscious mind, his swingman says proper behavior of the club just before, during, and after impact is for the club head to go from low to high as it's striking the ball. It's supposed to go from high to low to some degree, right? But
Sure.
because he had that image in his unconscious mind swing map, that's what his body was doing. So it took me about another hour to fix the excessive tilting of his spine to the right, thinking now I think we're done, right? Then he starts standing up. He starts popping up out of his spine angle. He wasn't doing that before either. It was like pushing on a balloon. You push on one part of the balloon and then the force goes elsewhere. It was sort of like that. It took till the end of the day, till all the different ways he kept trying to scoop. He finally had nothing left, and finally he starts hitting really good. Yeah, but that's a perfect example of what almost everybody I see who has any type of issue, yips or not, in the short game, we have to address the scooping impulse early on.
Yeah, yeah. Now, when you talk about controlling the spin, can you do that on all type of terrain, all turf, or is it really mainly on fairway?
On the good lies, yeah. I mean, if you're in the rough,
you can't. If you're in the rough, you can't control anything because
you're not going to get any spin because the grass gets caught between the back of the ball and the club face, and then when that happens, when the two surfaces contact each other, the grass gets compressed, and grass juice comes out and makes a film, and that film reduces the spin dramatically. Right.
Okay. So what that means is that when the ball lands, you're going to get more release on it. The ball's going to roll more.
Out. Correct.
So then don't be aiming at the hole.
Correct.
Right. You want, if you're coming out of the rough.
Roll out off the rough. Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
But when you're on the short grass and you're inside of what, 50?
50, 60 yards, somewhere in there. Yeah.
Okay. You want the ball, you want to try to get the ball to get, well, I mean, getting the amount of backspin that we watch on TV is just, forget it. You ain't gonna. We're not gonna do that
for sure. You don't want too much. That's also a problem. Most short game shots you want medium spin. There are some shots where you want no spin. There is classical chip shots where should be no spin. By the way, there's going to be a little spin anytime, even on a putt. There's a little tiny spin that happens.
Sure.
But by the time the ball lands, you want the backspin to have stopped. So when you hit a classical chip, you don't want backspin. It should land and roll out like a putt, right? But except for classical chipping, every other short game shot, except for classical chipping, you're going to have either low spin, medium spin, or high spin. Like on a cut lob, you know what a cut lob shot is, which is a type of a flop shot? Well, a cut lob is where you take your lob wedge and you basically take the club a little outside with the hand path and club head path and then cut across it, kind of like over the top like this.
You mean out to in?
Oh, yeah, out to in on purpose. And you pull your...
The thing that we're trying not to do?
Well, you do it on this shot. It's a specialty shot, right? Again, you do it. You got to learn to do it the right amount. You can obviously do it too much, but it's a slight out to in club head path, which is facilitated by bending your left elbow a little bit just before impact. You pull your left elbow a little bit and you roll the face open. So now you're coming in steep. Anytime your path is out to in, you're going to have a steeper angle of attack. The steeper the angle of attack, the more the edges of the grooves on your wedge bite into the cover of the ball and create spin. And when you rotate the face open, when the club face angle itself, the club face itself is rotating from square to open, that also creates more spin, right? And the fact that you're cutting across the ball from out to in path also creates more spin. So you're doing three things to create spin. So when I demonstrate that shot for my students, it doesn't go as high as a standard flop shot, what for example, Sevi would call his parachute shot, which is like straight up in the air. And that's actually a low spin shot, but it just lands because it goes straight up and it comes into the ground at a 90-degree angle.
Yeah,
so it doesn't need any spin, it just stops, right? But on a cut lob, you're putting maximum spin. It'll actually land and then take one bounce to the right, if you're a right-handed golfer, and then trickle out and have hardly any rollout because it's got so much spin. It's a cool-looking shot.
Yeah.
And it's the worst you have to have if the traditional flop shot, the ball has to be sitting up a little bit on a tuft of grass, right? Because you're coming in with almost traditional flop shot. You want like zero shaftling at impact. You want to be like straight up and down. Which means you have to come in very shallow, which means the ball has to be sitting up a little bit. It can't be sitting down on a tight line. It's a very difficult shot to do off a tight line. But the cut lob, you're coming in steeper and you're hitting down on the ball. And so that's the only shot that will work. That's the only super high trajectory shot that will work in a typical round of golf where the ball's not sitting up a little bit. So it's a good shot to learn, the cut lob. Yeah.
Yeah, and it'd be a good thing to know. Like, I know that I've had the results. And it's like, oh wow, look at that! The ball hit right here and stopped right next to the the divot. It's like an inch. How did I do that? I wish I knew how I did that.
Yeah.
And then I watch, and it's so bad to watch golf on TV because you're not learning things. You're just figuring out what you don't know how to do, and then you don't even practice it. But like when these guys, like they have they rarely have 75 yards to the pin because they're either 200 yards out or they're on the green.
Well, it depends. Sometimes they're 75 yards from the pin on a shorter par four.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Now they are
340 yards. Yeah.
Yeah. But what they do is, like, let's just say they're at 75 yards and they're like, okay, the pin is at 75 yards. I got to hit it 79 yards because it's going to spin back.
Yeah.
Those 4 yards. And it's like, that just is amazing to me that happens.
It's interesting that, because generally speaking, they don't like that shot. Sometimes they'll do that shot.
Really?
It's the only option that they have. But generally they're trying not to put too much spin from that distance, from about 65, 70 yards to about 120 yards. There's a category of short game called distance wedges. Have you heard that term, distance wedges?
No.
It's a term that Dave Pelz came up with about 35 years ago, and pretty much everybody today uses it. But when you're in that sort of 65, 70 to whatever your full gap wedge is, so for me that's 100 yards. For a long hitter, it might be 120. There's a particular type of shot in there, and you want a medium spin type of shot. You don't want to suck it back unless you absolutely have to. Yeah.
And what does that, wait, when you say you absolutely have to,
right?
What are the conditions that you face that you're going, I absolutely have to spin it back?
It could be that because of could be like water in front of the green, or some other type of hazard be in the back of the green, where like tall grass or something. In other words, it might be a situation where the only shot that you feel that you could stick it close would be a shot with high spin. But in general, a tour pro is not trying to hit that shot. They talk about it a lot on TV because it looks cool, but top players don't like to have that much spin. They can't control the carry distance as well when there's that much backspin, and often it spins back too much, right? So what they're generally doing on a distance wedge, they're trying to take spin off. And the way they take spin off is they don't complete their backswing. They don't do a quite full turn on their backswing. So if a normal backswing is, say, 100 degrees of shoulder turn, right? They'll do 90 degrees of shoulder turn.
Okay.
Right? And there's something called a kinematic sequence. You know what kinematic sequence means?
Keep talking.
Kinematic sequence is the technical term for how you transfer energy from one body part to the next and eventually down into the club head during the downswing, during the forward swing. And the typical kinematic sequence is, on a power swing shot, is your lower body starts first, then your mid body, then your upper body, then your arms, then your wrists, then the club head. So there's a transfer of energy, sort of like when a whip master cracks a bullwhip, there's a transfer of energy. There's much less transfer of energy on a distance wedge, which is why it flies at a lower trajectory and has less spin. So the ball doesn't stay on the face it stays on the face for a shorter interval of time than on the same guy with the same club, even with a power swing. In other words, the ball will compress against the face more on a power swing and therefore have more spin. So some people call the distance wedge, that shot, like Pelz years ago called it a finesse swing. And the way he tried to get people to learn it was, you want to feel like the RPM speed of your hips and your core and your chest are all moving at the same speed, both on the backswing and the forward swing, which is kind of one way you can do it. Whereas in a normal swing, your hips fire first, then they decelerate in the power swing, then the core fires, then it decelerates a little bit, and then the energy from the hips transfers to the core. When the core slows down, it transfers to your upper torso, your chest, your shoulder girdle, and it slows down as the wrists are uncocking. So again, it's that whip cracking thing. So it's about taking some of the whip cracking element away. So it feels like it feels more like a finesse swing. Some people call it a more armsy, like Tiger calls it a more armsy swing, you know? Mm-hmm. So it's a softer version of your full swing is one way you can think of it. Yeah.
Wow. Awesome.
And that even applies more on shots within 65 yards of the hole, where I want my students to feel like the RPM speed of their chest on the forward swing and their hands slash arms and the club head are the same. Now, the club head will always be moving a little faster in RPM speed, unless you're doing classical chipping where there's no wrist action. So at a classical chip shot, which is a good example because it's so extreme, there's no wrist action. So in a classical chip shot, the club head and your hands and your chest are all moving at the same RPM speed just before, during, and after impact. Whereas hardly any amateurs know this. And so they're trying to make the club head move faster than their hand, which again is another way you could describe as scooping. Or they're trying to make their hands move faster than their body, which they disconnect, their arms come off their chest slows down or stalls. They have an armsy release. Yeah.
Amazing. All right, another timeout. We'll be back right after this. I love talking about the short game with you. It's something we really don't spend enough time on, but I think it's so important because there's so many, like you said, myths about the short game that we need to figure out and get past. But I want to go back to, you talked about distance control, trajectory control, spin control. We talked a lot about the spin. Let's talk about the other parts of that as well, the distance and trajectory control.
Yeah. Well, again, except for a classical chip where there's no wrist cock, except for that one shot, every other shot, since there's some degree of wrist cock, it might only be a quarter of a wrist cock. So what I teach is that there's several different types of wrist cock. You got 0 on a classical chip, so no wrist action. You got a quarter wrist cock, which is a tiny amount, obviously, on what we call a chip-pitch, also called modern chipping. Modern chipping, which is what you see in the younger players mostly today, is where they fly the ball about 80% of the way to the hole when they're chipping, and it trickles out the other 20%. Whereas classical chipping, they might fly it only halfway to the hole or less, or a third of the way to the hole, and it'll roll out 2/3.
I see.
So what I call modern chipping chip-pitching, because it has a pitching aspect, which is there is some wrist cock. Therefore, there's some wrist cock release on the forward swing. So a quarter wrist cock would be the second type. Then there's a half a wrist cock, right? And which on shorter pitches would work. And then there's a full wrist cock on longer pitches.
Okay, but I'm going to stop you here because you keep saying wrist cock and you're doing stuff with your hands. I can't see your hands, nor can the audience. So define what you mean by wrist cock. Are we talking? Please explain.
Sure. So from setup, from address position, if you simply moved your wrists straight up toward the sky, so the club head would go up toward the sky because your wrists are hinging or cocking straight up. Yeah.
Okay.
That's called cocking in golf instruction lingo.
Versus flexing.
Versus some people call flexing. I prefer the old school term hinging. When you go backwards with your wrist, that's called hinging.
Okay.
And in the power swing, you hinge back until your lead wrist bows or flattens a little bit while you cock up. So it's a combination of hinging and cocking in your normal power swing. In the short game, there are some shots where you'll only hinge and then hold the hinge angle without cocking, which is one way to do classical chipping. There are short game shots where you'll do a little bit of hinge and a little bit of cocking, like I said, like a chip pitch, like a quarter, or you could add more cocking. So there's always some degree of hinging in any short game shot, right? But you could have either no wrist cock, quarter wrist cock, half a wrist cock, full wrist cock. And the wrist cock, the more wrist cock you add on the backswing, the higher the ball goes in trajectory, the further it goes in carry distance, and the more spin it has. So a quarter wrist cock will fly much lower than a full wrist cock. It won't go nearly as far in the air, right? And it'll have much less spin than a full wrist cock. Yeah. And
we're talking on the pitching and chipping side. We're not talking full swing, or we are?
Well, again, we're talking in terms of what I just said about the 0, 1, 2, we're talking mainly short game. And your power swing, you're always going to do a stock movement with your wrist, which is cocking fully, full range of motion, full cock, along with hinging back enough to flatten or slightly bow your lead wrist. There's some advantage, I think, and most teachers would agree, to have a slightly bowed lead wrist, right? It tends to give
That's been very challenging for me to get that bow because I always had a tendency on my lead wrist to
cup,
hinge it back, cup it back.
Yeah.
And I've worked very hard on that over the years. And I've always seen the difference. It's just, something that I had that problem when I was taking piano lessons as a little kid. They were like, lift your wrist, lift your wrist. And then when I was taking typing class, we actually had typing class in school when I went there. And I cheated and I failed. And again, I was like, had these little, I hate to say limp wrists, but I was, hinging back.
Yeah.
And so I noticed I've done that, in everything I've done. So it's been very hard for me to get that motion correct.
Yeah.
But it pays off.
Along with scooping, what we see in terms of flaws, we see a lot of overuse of the wrist. So a lot of people, they're also scooping generally along with this, but they just don't know how to use the wrist properly in the short game. They don't know about what I just said about you could have 0, 1/4 wrist cock, half a wrist cock. But it's not that hard to learn how to do it. I mean, most of my students can learn to do it in a couple hours. They can alter on command. They can do a half a wrist cock. They can do a quarter. They can do a full. They can do none. And once you've mastered those 4 wrist setting angles, it makes a huge difference on the quality of your short game shots. It really does.
Incredible. Yeah. Okay. So now we were talking about trajectory and we did spin control. Now distance control.
That's
critically important. Critically important.
Well, let me tell you how I teach it. The first thing I tell people, look, distance control, you're wasting your time trying to learn it if you're not making solid contact. And that not only center face contact between, the club face and the back of the ball, but also having such good control over your angle of attack and your low point and your shaft lean that the interaction between the sole of the club and the turf is also an important part of the short game, right? You need to know how the club head interacts with the ground just before, in most cases, or just after impact, or while the club face and ball are touching each other. How does that bottom of the club, the bounce of the club especially, interact with the turf? That's a big part of it. But once you can start, right? Because if you don't make solid, if you tend to hit the first wedge, the first pitch shot a little thin, it's going to travel too far. It's going to carry too far, and it's going to roll out too far too. So it doesn't have enough spin. And if you hit the next one heavy, it's going to travel way short. It's going to carry short of your landing spot. So you got to be able to make solid contact first. But once you do that, the way I teach distance control is one of the myths is that you should change your tempo. And I hear people say, I don't want to have a system because I'm a field player. And my response is every good player is a field player. The story we tell ourselves can be, I had a conversation with Faldo about this years ago. You can tell yourself that you're an analytical player, someone like Bryson DeChambeau, right? The story he says to explain his success is analytical, scientific, technical, versus someone who's more intuitive, like a Seve Ballesteros. He'll talk about fields all day long. But the reality is everybody who's good plays from field. But that doesn't mean you can't have a system which is mainly centered around how big a backswing you make, right? And when I work with someone who tells me that they're decent at distance control, particularly in the distance wedges from that like 65 to 120 yard range, they're usually terrible at it. That's been my experience. And the guys and gals who actually have a system based on length of backswing are good. Yeah. So in my pitching system, there's 2 lengths of backswing, right? Which are using, how the clock face analogy works for a right-handed player, the left arm is the clock face, is the clock, the hour hand. So you go 730 would be a short pitch, right? And that when you move your left arm to 730 in the clock face, you're doing it with your pivot. You're not doing it with your arm muscles going you're not moving your arm sideways across your chest. It's a way of measuring how big a pivot.
Okay.
So 730 with the left arm is about a 45-degree rotation of your torso, roughly, right? Okay. And then there's 9 o'clock, also called a 3/4 backswing. That's about a 75-degree rotation of your torso. Yeah. So in my pitching system, you have to learn how to do a 730 backswing, and you have to learn how to do a 9 o'clock backswing. And there's 3 baseline distances. There's a short distance pitch from 730 with a half a wrist cock. There's a medium distance pitch from 9 o'clock with half a wrist cock. And there's a long distance pitch, which is 9 o'clock with a full wrist cock. So for example, with my lob wedge, which is 60 degrees loft, my full long distance, longer pitch, which again is 9 o'clock full wrist cock, flies exactly 50 yards. Basically, it goes almost straight up in the air, travels 50 yards. My medium, which is 9 o'clock with half a wrist cock, flies 12 yards less. It flies 38 yards. And my 730 with half a wrist cock flies 25 yards. So I've got 3 baseline distances with that club and with my 55-degree sandwich. Right?
Practice.
Yeah, and
so important to practice this information.
Don't believe this BS that you can get a good short game in terms of distance control by just going by feel. It's just not true. You have to have a way of regulating it, a consistent way, and it's two things. It's length of backswing, meaning length of pivot, and how much wrist cock you use. Those 2 things are what create the carry distance. What you don't do is you never change the rhythm, and you never change the tempo. Those have to be a constant to be consistent.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? So the rhythm is the relationship. There's more than one way to define rhythm, but the way I most commonly do it for short game students is the relationship in terms of the RPM speed of your chest rotating on the backswing versus the forward swing. And that relationship should be 2 to 1, meaning we call it 5-10 rhythm. So if your backswing was 5 RPMs, chest rotation, on a chip or a pitch, your forward swing speed should be 10, twice as much. 5-10. Whereas typically when someone has poor short game technique, even when their wrist action's better and their length of backswing is pretty much where we want it, they can still hit a chip or a pitch poor distances because the rhythm might be 5-15 and they'll hit it too far on the first shot, and the next shot it'll be 5-7, which is a decel, and they'll hit it too short. So you have to have that. You have to practice through repetition. You have to master that 5-10 rhythm. Yeah. And the tempo basically means the length of time of your backswing and your forward swing in the short game, especially within 65 yards, should be identical. And that length of time is going to be about roughly 3/4 of a second. So 3/4 of a second backswing, 3/4 of a second forward swing. It's very common for people to over-accelerate their pivot because they don't understand what I'm talking about in terms of rhythm and tempo. And so if they over-accelerate their pivot, they'll do 5-15 rhythm, and they'll hit the ball too far, right? And the next shot, they'll decel, they'll stall their pivot, and they'll do 5-7 rhythm, and they'll hit the ball too short. So having a consistent tempo, which again, the tempo itself in terms of the overall RPM speed is going to be about 25 to 30% slower than your power swing. So it takes a little bit of practice to learn how to make your chest rotate on a consistent basis around 25, 30% slower. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. One more time out. We'll be back right after this. This is one of those episodes, Jim, and it probably happens on your episodes more than most, well, because you're on more than most, but you got to listen to it multiple times because there's so much to absorb. It's like, wait, I got to take notes on this now. And I think now the Apple Podcasts, they put transcripts up.
Cool.
Yeah. There's a transcript going. So you don't want to be watching your phone while you're listening to the podcast, but the transcripts are there. Yeah. But when you said, that you ask students is like, how's your day? Oh, I'm pretty good at my short game, right? It frustrates me to no end when I'm playing with guys who are, within 50, 60 yards and they get all excited because they're on the green. And it's like, no. When you're there, you're supposed to be able to put the ball in a place where you can one putt. That's right? It's turning 3 shots into 2. That's where your scoring is. So if you're just on the green, it's, okay, way, celebrate, woo, except the pin is on the complete opposite side of the green of where you are. Just because you're on the green doesn't mean it. So it's not about getting there and then 2-putting, thinking you've had success. Yeah, that's not what your short game
for the rest of your life. If that's your short game goal, is to 2-putt after what you think is a decent short game shot. So, well, my recommendation, sort of my guidelines for this issue, somewhat depends on your skill level. But let's say you're about a 5 handicap or better, right?
Yeah.
If you're doing a chip shot within, say, 20 yards of the hole or less, And I'm talking about decent lie chip shot, not in the rough, not super tight, but kind of a decent lie, average lie. You got to be chipping it within 3 feet of the hole. That should be your goal. 3 feet or less, right? When you're in that sort of 20 to like 50 yard range, you want to be within 5 feet of the hole.
Wow.
A little bit longer because bunker shots are a little harder to control distance, maybe more like 6 or 7 feet from the greenside bunker. And when you get in that sort of like, 60 to 90 yard range, you want to be like in, 8 or 9 feet from the hole. Because your odds of making a putt, if you're outside 6 feet, are a little less than 50%.
Right.
If you're outside 6 feet. And that's if you're pretty decent at short putting. So you really have to think of it like that. I got to hit this thing pretty close to get up and down. I can't be expecting a one putt from 12, 15 feet. I think the average make percentage from 15 feet in the PGA Tour is around 16 to 17%, something like that. It's not.
Oh, it's that high?
Yeah.
That low. I'm sorry. I meant to say that, like, I thought 10-foot putts are like 50% on the tour.
It's actually, I think on the tour right now, the 50% mark is 6.5 or 7 feet, something like that.
Wow. And why do we beat ourselves up?
Exactly. Yeah. We could do a whole other podcast just on putting, but that's one of the big things we see in putting. Amateurs have insanely unrealistic expectations.
Yeah.
Because when the typical amateur golfer is watching a PGA Tour event, he sees these guys that are on the leaderboard making everything they look at pretty much on the putting green, right? So it creates the illusion that it's sort of normal for them to be making 10-footers or 15-footers, whereas the actual average is much less than that, right? Yeah, so people get this idea that they're supposed to make, every time they have a 6, 7, 8-foot putt, that they're supposed to make it. They don't even realize for an amateur golfer it's more likely than not you're going to miss that putt, even if you're good at putting. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Are you all caught up on this lie angle balance, the lab putters? It's an Oregon thing.
A little bit, but yeah, I probably need to educate myself more about it, but I've been hearing more about it just in the last month or so.
Yeah, well, because Adam Scott does it, and Will Zalatoris came back from his injury. He's got the lab putter. But what Lucas Glover did last year after having severe yips and then coming back, and their whole thing is you're just, they say, untorque yourself, because with face balance and heel balance putters, there's a lot of torque that you have to do when you're putting, and these just, wherever you're pointing your putter, it's going to go in that direction, and the
face doesn't rotate relative to the path. The face stays neutral to the path. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, you should definitely get in touch with Sam. He's in Oregon. He's right where you are. So.
Oh, is that right? Is he in Portland? Do you think?
No, he's not in Portland. He's near you. He's outside Eugene.
Oh, outside Eugene. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. He's a great guy. Great guy.
We'll do it.
Yeah. So let's talk about one of the parts about chipping that there's a lot of dispute or approaches to it, and that is just off the green.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily just off the green where you can putt from just off the green. That you've got some rough, or you've got something, a little ditch or something.
Yeah.
One of the things that Tony Manzoni instructed me to do years ago was take my 8-iron, use it like a putter with the toe down, heel up on it, and get it close to my feet and just do a putting motion. And that has worked very well for me in the past.
Yeah, that traditionally people call that a putt chip. It's also called the Paul Runyon putt chip method, because Runyon back in the 1930s kind of came up with it. Because if you're hitting it you hit it a little toward the toe, there's less likelihood that you'll hit it fat because the heel's up in the air a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It won't work if it's a bad lie. The ball has to be in a pretty decent lie for that to work. But yeah, and if you're just off the green, that can definitely work literally using a putting stroke. So I consider that one of the essential, not the essential, but one of the little bit more advanced type of a shot that you can call a specialty short game shot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the putt chip. Yeah. But we're seeing today is a resurgence, thankfully, finally, because I've been a big preacher I've been a big advocate for traditional or classical or Scottish chipping, also called chip and run shot.
Mm-hmm.
which kind of fell out of favor starting about 20 years ago. In fact, you won't see it that often on the PGA Tour. Well, as of until about a year ago. Now we're starting to see some of the younger players do it. Jordan Spieth will do it whenever he can. Justin Thomas will do Scottish chipping whenever he can. I saw, who was it the other day? Actually, it was Zalatoris doing it. They were talking about it, where you have the handle raised up a little bit. Well, Scottish chipping it looks almost like a putting setup. Except your feet are very close together. You have about 20% more weight on your front foot, so you're kind of leaning forward a little bit. And you have about 4 inches of shaft lean at setup, and you want to maintain that 4 inches of shaft lean. You don't change it throughout the stroke.
Forward shaft lean.
Yeah, forward shaft lean. And you have your wrists arched up a little bit, so the handle's about an inch or two higher than neutral. When you raise the handle, that automatically shallows your angle of attack. So it's less likely that the leading edge will dig. The traditional critique of Scottish chipping, how it fell out of favor about 20 years ago, was that the leading edge will dig, particularly in tight lies. So in very tight lies, particularly if the ground's wet, the leading edge would dig and you would leave the ball be way short of the hole because you'd be hitting it fat. But I think some of that was because of, I think at the time where Scottish chipping got the bad rep that it got, it was because people were teaching it wrong. I don't want to name names, but there were some famous teachers who were teaching ball way, way back in the stance, like in line with your right heel, or even further back than that. And when you have the ball position that far back in your stance, of course the leading edge is going to dig because you're coming in too steep. The angle of attack is too steep.
I see.
Right? Whereas the way I was taught to do as a kid is you put the ball in the middle of your stance. Your feet are about 6 inches apart. Ball's in the middle. 20% weight on your front foot, 4 inches of shaft lean, and simply maintain the 4 inches of shaft lean, right, along with the slightly arched wrists, which have been raising the handle. So now you're coming in on a 5 to a 10 degree angle attack instead of more than 10 degrees. And the leading edge doesn't dig, right? So we're finally seeing, just in the last year, more and more of the younger pros are realizing that's actually an easier shot to do under pressure.
And when do you use that shot?
What's that?
Where do you use that shot? What's the, the instance of that you need it?
Well, you would do it for any type of chipping situation where you have some green to work with, right? Let's say, 10 feet or more of green to work with. And the lie's decent. It doesn't work out of the rough, right? It has to be a normal fairway lie. But would be within, typically, when you're about anywhere from about 10 yards away from the pin up to about 35 yards away from the pin, in that range.
Okay.
Yeah. And the ball, again, depending which club you use. In my system, there's several different clubs. You use a 6-iron, 8-iron, gap wedge, sand wedge, lob wedge, only those 5 clubs. So look, with the gap wedge, which is the one you're going to use the most, if it's a level green, no wind, and the green's running sort of average speed, maybe 10 on the stimp meter, the gap wedge will fly, like mine flies 15 yards in the air from classical chipping backswing at 7:15 on the clock face with my left arm. It'll fly exactly 15 yards in the air and it'll roll out 15 yards. So the carry roll ratio with a gap wedge is 50-50. With a 6-iron, it's 20% carry, 80% roll out. With an 8-iron, it's 1/3 carry, 2/3 roll. With a sand wedge, it's 2/3 carry, 1/3 roll. And with a lob wedge, it's 80% carry, 20% roll out. Again, that's if it's a level green, obviously. So you only, in my chipping system, classical chipping, you only have those 5 clubs. And that turns out once you've mastered that technique, if you're playing on normal sized greens, not ginormous, Jack Nicklaus, Pete Dye greens, where you might have, one or more big swales between you and the pin, in which case now you got to figure out how much break the chip's going to have after it starts to roll. It's better just to pitch it, airmail it there, right? Instead of doing a classical chip. So if they're not big greens or not really small greens, like my home course here in Enterprise is probably smallest greens of any golf course in the country. They're insanely small, and they're like inverted saucers.
Oh, wow.
So it's hard to do classical chipping because there's not enough green. You'd be blowing it by the hole. But if you play on medium-sized greens, which is 99% of golf courses are medium-sized greens, as it turns out, classical chipping will be the most commonly used short game shot, for sure. So to me, I consider it the foundation of the short game technique, classical chipping.
Awesome. Well, time to go. But again, I want to thank you and just let, if you're new to Golf Smarter, then you've got to just go back in our archives because Jim's been here since almost the beginning, early 2000s. And we get together regularly, including episode 400, where we had Chinese food together in Oregon. Thai food, right. We went for Thai food in Oregon. We sat down. That was it.
And episode 800 is where I got to interview you, right?
That's right. 800, you interviewed me. That's right. Yeah. Oh, my gosh. Jimmy, thank you so much. BalancePointGolf.com, right?
Correct. That's the best way to reach me.
It's always a lesson and an education when we get together, and I truly appreciate your friendship, man.
Thanks, man. Likewise.
So I need to clarify a comment I made early in the interview about my tennis elbow recovery. Yes, I did play 2.5 weeks ago, and you probably heard that I had my PXG driver fitting a couple of days after that. But since then, no golf. I did go to the driving range to test out my new driver, and honestly, going up against my trusted Callaway X-Hot, the PXG Black Ops driver was longer and straighter every swing. But the pain in my arm persists. I'm going back to physical therapy tomorrow, and I have asked my doctor about doing something more aggressive, but have yet to hear back from her. I say that because I am absolutely determined to get some rounds in this spring because I need to be 100% ready for our Golf Smarter Royal Adventure to Northern Ireland. I really want to play golf and hang out with you for a week. I've never played there before, and this is a total bucket list opportunity for me. Hopefully it is for you too. But even if you've already played there before, please join me this July for 5 rounds that includes the #1 course in the world, Royal County Downs, the host of the 2025 Open Championship, Royal Portrush. And what a rush that would be to be able to watch it and say, yeah, I played there last year. Also, one of the most beautiful courses you'll ever see at Ardglass, and we'll even play a parkland course with the oldest clubhouse in the world, Royal Belfast. I've partnered up with TMI Golf, and we only have room for 2 foursomes, but the clock is ticking. You can get all the information at tmigolf.com/golfsmarter or at golfsmarter.com to hear our featured conversation about the trip that was released just a few minutes after episode 940 with Tara Fox last week. This Friday is part 3 of our annual series with the late Tony Manzoni. And since Tony passed away in 2018, we've been playing select episodes each year to get back into playing shape for spring. What's different this year is that we're playing every episode in order that we did with Tony between 2010 and his final appearance in June of 2017. The huge difference is Golf Smarter Mulligans is no longer a separate podcast. Now it's included in your free Golf Smarter subscription and is released every Friday. So Golf Smarter is really twice a week. Tuesdays are the brand new episodes, and then we dig into our archives each Friday. This week's episode is just after Tony released his book with Paul Cervantes, The Lost Fundamental, One Simple Move, Better Golf Forever. And even if you've heard any of these before, there's always a golden nugget tucked away that reminds you of one more effective insight to bring to your game. If you're one of our Golf Smarter ambassadors that is opened an episode, make sure you read my personal invitation email that I sent you about our Royal Adventure. It may have gotten into your spam or junk filter because the email came from Fred S. Greene, not Golf Smarter Podcast. But I do want to thank our newest Golf Smarter ambassador, Denny Harris of Gage, Oklahoma. Denny chose to receive a free link to Tony Manzoni's video of The Lost Fundamental just for telling us where he's from, where he plays, and what episode number this is. If you'd like to choose one of 3 great gifts, write directly to me, and I'll send you simple instructions on how to record. Check out today's show notes to find links about each gift that you have to choose from. And remember that links to our sponsors and their special offers are also in today's show notes and our blog posts. Please check them out as a way to say thank you for keeping Golf Smarter podcast coming week after week. And if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for upcoming episodes, or need more information and want to discuss our royal adventure, please write to golfsmarterpodcast@gmail.com or click on the Hey Fred button when you visit golfsmarter.com.